Thanks for listening to this latest episode of Drinking on the Edge, this one featuring Carlo DeVito. Most recently, Carlo was featured in a new documentary released in June 2023 entitled Fire, Water, and Grain, The Story of Empire Rye, telling the story of New York whiskey distilleries' focus on rye as their main ingredient in fashioning their whiskeys. It's available on streaming services such as Prime and Tubi. Fire, Water, and Grain, The Story of Empire Rye contains more from Carlo DeVito and from Brian McKenzie, the owner and operator of Finger Lakes Distilling, that was featured in our second episode in the Finger Lakes. This is our first foray into having the subject of one of our segments live in the studio. I'm with Carlo DeVito, who's an author on many things, but we're here focusing on his recent books on whiskey and other drinks. Carlo is a resident in Catskill, but here he is today in Rhinecliff. Welcome, Carlo.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right. So to give some context to Carlo's great appreciation, understanding, communication of whiskeys, our subject for this segment, it's worth knowing a bit about Carlo's background because he's not just a whiskey writer. He's not even just a writer. Carlo, how'd you get into this thing? Give us the condensed version of your entire career, please.
Well, stupidity is a main ingredient no matter what I do. I started off in publishing and I edited a number of books in the first in science and history, but eventually I got more into what we call sin books. So we did the original Bourbon Companion with Gary Regan, Gaz, and we also did one of his first cocktail books, first among many, of course. And I used to shepherd all the books for the Wine Spectator book program. Moved on to a different job, and I started editing wine, beers, and spirits books. Kevin Zraly, Matt Kramer, Oz Clark, did the PDT cocktail book with Jim Meehan, did the New York Times Essential Guide to Cocktails, and published Clay Risen's first book on whiskey, bourbon, and rye.
So for the people who aren't aware of necessarily those names of those authors, with the exception of Oz Clark, those are all the top names in American spirits and cocktail communications, writings, speeches, etc., etc. And Oz Clark is more of a wine guy. He's very English. I believe he went to Oxford. He's an Oxford man.
He's a very smart man. One of the smartest people I've ever chatted with. I actually sat in a room once with him and Kevin and Matt Kramer, and it was a fantastic conversation having those three real wine titans chatting. Anyway, so I got into the booze business by originally. I founded the Hudson Chatham Winery with my wife Dominique, and I've since gone on. We've sold that, and it was the Hudson Chatham Winery. Since gone on to become a winemaker at Unionville Vineyards, and I write books, and I've written, I guess, about 24 books or so. Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, a lot of sports biographies, and probably.
Did you know all those guys?
Yeah,
Wow.
I did not know Yogi Berra. I just want to say I did not grow up with Yogi Berra. I know I'm getting older. So I started editing a lot of whiskey books, and finally at one point, the publisher was like, why don't you just write a whiskey book? You've been doing this forever. Because I've been editing wine, beers, and spirits now for, 17 to 20 years. I lie about my age on Tinder, honestly. So I wrote Big Whiskey,
which is published in 2021.
Yes, that was the second edition of that. Yep.
Excuse me. Okay.
Yeah, the first whiskey book I did was the new single malt, which was about how single malt was now being made around the world, not just in Scotland.
And don't we now in the U.S. have a federal assignation for what constitutes an American single malt?
You sound just like my publisher. Like, don't you want to redo that book? And I was like, a 700-page book. No, I do not want to do that book. And then I did 2 editions of Big Whiskey. The Spirit of Rye,
which is what brings us here today.
Right.
It's a compendium of rye whiskeys, not only in the U.S. but also Canada and other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's mostly just North America. Just
okay.
North America.
Good enough.
Good enough. And so that was named one of the top 10 books of the year by Tales of the Cocktail, which I was very happy about. Got a lot of great reviews. And then the newest book, which will be coming out just shortly, is
Drinks. Drink the Northeast. Look at that. And it includes coverage of breweries, distilleries, wineries in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and our home state of New York.
Yeah, New York is just tangential in this project. It's sort of like, where can you go in New York if you're in Massachusetts, Connecticut?
I see. So you don't reach out to the finger length.
I did, but the publisher was like, "Well, it's going to be a 1,000-page book. We're
Exactly.
going to cut this. We'll have to talk about another book after that."
That's fine. We covered the Finger Lakes and Drinking on the Edge in the
I was
previous
just there.
episode.
I had a ball. It was crazy.
All right. So we are here today. So that's a fantastic career you've had, Carlo. Clearly, you've.
I do need a new liver, by the way.
We'll look into that. And just to drop some names, you were editing not only alcohol beverage books, you went to some serious writers too, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. I've been very lucky in my career. Worked with, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Dan Rather, Stephen Hawking. I've worked with about 6 different Pulitzer Prize winners. So I've been very lucky in my life to work with some really cool people.
And well, we're really grateful to have you here today. Clearly, you're a talented man. Your books are doing well. And so what I have you here today specifically to talk about is one of my passions, and that is rye whiskey. I was very happy to see your Spirit of Rye book, to give it a nice review, too.
You did give me a lovely review. Thank you very much.
And I've been writing about rye whiskeys because it's a minor passion of mine. I don't have nearly the depth of knowledge and expertise that you do, but this is, if anybody likes rye whiskeys, if you want something that is just totally comprehensive and will talk to everything you can possibly find here in North America, you got to get a copy of this. Go to Carlo's website, go to his publisher's website for the Spirit of Rye. But what is rye whiskey, Carlo?
Rye whiskey is the original American whiskey. Distilling was very popular in the colonies in the North. Originally, you saw a lot of distilleries making rye, and then maybe later on, they also made some cider, some hard cider. And what really happened was, with the advent of the ending of the slave trade and our breaking with Britain, there was a need for a spirit, and there wasn't, sugar became very, very expensive.
So the rums that were coming up from the Caribbean, from the British colonies down there, they were no longer so popular.
No, they weren't popular, and they were hard to get and very expensive. So what happened was, and of course this brings you right back to grade school, farmers started trying to make their own whiskeys. At the end of the season, you would have leftover grains. And what do you do with those grains? They're not going to last forever.
This is before we had good silos and good storage capacities, plus transportation. The railway system hadn't been built, or if it did, it wasn't operating to great capacity.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you had to do something back in those days with your grain, otherwise you could kiss it by. And when you were a northern farmer, and I went back and I went into all these agricultural studies, because it's really interesting. Why is it rye? In the North, you grew corn, you grew wheat, you tried to grow barley, and you grew rye. At the end of the summer, anybody who lives up here and north of here, corn is in short supply. And if you're a farmer, what you don't eat or sell for grist or flour, you're feeding to your animals. There's not a lot of corn left over at the end of a season for a colonial farmer. Wheat, you're growing wheat. Wheat makes great flour. You're selling that off. Wheat is one of the best things you can grow. Again, it's a limited thing. You need a warmer climate to grow wheat in large quantities. And our soil is very acidic, so it isn't really hospitable to wheat. And we get a little too much wet weather. So rye, really, barley, again, you can grow it, but you're not going to grow a lot of it. What's left over at the end of the season is rye. Rye is in love with New England soils. Northeast soils, they're acidic. The weather is perfect for rye. It's cold. You can grow rye on rocks as long as there's a little dirt there. Rye is great like that. And so at the end of the season, a farmer had a lot more leftover rye than he had anything else. And that's what they started to distill. It wasn't like you were sitting there going, well, are they going to make a rye? I'll have to grow more rye. That's what was left over. That's what you started making, because you didn't want it to spoil in your barn. You know, with the rats. It was done out of necessity. And
to have something to keep you warm during those cold winters.
So in the colonial era, it was not barrel aged. You sold it as new make.
Oh, so it was clear. It wasn't brown necessarily.
No. Okay. Matter of fact, the browning happened more by accident. People would put it in barrels. They were starting to make
for transportation purposes.
For transportation purposes.
Or just general storage, yeah.
Washington, at the time of his death, was the
George
largest.
Washington.
George Washington. Yes, thank you very much. Was the largest distiller in America at the time.
Right.
Well beyond what Overholt was. Overholt was only beginning at that time.
And Overholt, for those people not familiar, Overholt is a very famous brand of whiskey, most notably for its rye whiskeys, and still has a brand today of that name.
Yep. So he would ship his rye across to Alexandria, or down to Alexandria, I should say.
Virginia.
Virginia. And, but what happened was you started having all this rye. Now we're going to ship it down to New Orleans. We're going to ship it to some of the big cities. And while it's sitting, they didn't ship it by bottle. You shipped whiskey by barrel. And that was happening in England as well.
On a boat.
On a boat, mostly on a boat. It's very hard to drag with a horse and carriage. It's just a barrel of whiskey at 53 gallons weighs almost 500 pounds. Not something you really want to be dragging around.
Not even for a strong horse.
Not even with a strong horse. So you'd start storing whiskey in barrels simply for storage or transportation. And as it started to brown, people were like, "Oh, hey, that's pretty good. We like that." But originally, most whiskey was new make, and it wasn't really until
Moonshine, White Dog,
all that
White Lightning,
Corn in a Jar is one of my favorite new ones that I was just reading about.
All right.
So it's not until the early to mid 1800s that you really start to see the brown whiskeys start to happen.
Understood. And so rye kind of went into hibernation culturally here in the United States for a while. Rye was like people would use rye in lieu of the term whiskey for some time. I remember that from movies from the 1940s, even 1950s. But then the prevalence of rye came to really diminish. Bourbon was a thing. So why? What happened, and what is the relationship between bourbon and rye? For those who don't know,
that's a great question. All right, so the first thing is let's differentiate bourbon and rye. Rye is 61, a minimum legally
by U.S. law.
By law is 61% rye grain, and then you could have a mixture of other grains. Usually it's corn. Very few people put in wheat, but that's becoming more popular with crafters. And there's usually 5 to 10% malted barley. Some actually malt their own rye to make sure it's 100% rye. Again, not common. But it's got to be a minimum of 61% rye. Bourbon, on the other hand, is made using 61% corn. And again, this is literally all about agriculture. And I'm back into the agricultural records. As you come down into Kentucky, you can't grow rye as well. So at the end of the year, what they really do well is corn. So Kentucky and Tennessee I got a lot of corn left over. I don't necessarily have a lot of wheat left over. Don't necessarily have a lot of barley. Matter of fact, even today, most barley is imported into Kentucky and Tennessee.
Got it.
So what happens is if you're up in New England, you're making a very high rye whiskey. And then as you come further south,
down the
Baltimore,
River,
you start to see agricultural records where you've got more corn being introduced to the rye, but it's still rye.
So it's geographic and climatically determined.
Exactly. And then you get down in Kentucky, and now you're like, hey, all I got left over is corn and a few other things.
So I came to learn that in some of my research and writings that there is a long tradition of rye whiskeys in this part of the U.S. So the states that we've talked about here, the one you just mentioned, Maryland and Virginia, and New York, known for their rye, and Pennsylvania, known for their rye whiskey. So do you consider our, mid-Atlantic, southern New England area the heartland of rye whiskeys?
Historically, yes. Now, especially with the advent of the craft revolution, you're seeing across the northern states. So, you're looking at Illinois, Indiana, not so much, but some. Then you get to Michigan, Minnesota, the Dakotas. There you start to see a big prevalence of rye again, because those are big rye growing regions.
Got it. And of course, rye, from what I know about Europe, rye is much more popular in northern and eastern European countries. And so through that, you've got, if you track the patterns of immigration to the U.S., you got a lot of the Scandinavian folks ending up in Minnesota, other places. You have a lot of Germans and Poles and in other places. And this is where I've discovered you find a greater prevalence of rye used in it. And that's a little bit cultural, and that's a little bit historic, how rye kind of tracked through the United States as well.
And it's a little bit regional, but it's all those things. It's absolutely, you're 100% correct. So it's really fascinating. The craft movement, you see exactly that as you go through, and it's really quite fascinating. So rye did disappear during Prohibition. I think one of the fascinating things, as you go through all this, is that come the end of Prohibition, there were no American stocks of whiskey left. Really, I mean, very, very little, if any.
You sold what you had because there wasn't much. You weren't allowed to make it all that.
You weren't allowed to make it.
Legally, at least.
No, not legally. So what happened then, there was a huge cultural divide there, because what happened was, at that time, there's not a lot of whiskey available in the United States, certainly not at a wholesale level, certainly American whiskey. So the Canadians and the distillers from Scotland and the UK literally had ships waiting off the shore, and they flooded the market. And if you're an American, you're like, hey, that's all the whiskey I can get. I'm going to just do what I can. And that's when the advent of foreign whiskey or imported whiskey becomes this big phenomenon. Before that, it was not a big thing. And matter of fact, what I try to explain to a lot of people is that single malt whiskey didn't even appear in the United States until 1964 with the advent of, I think it's Glenfiddich.
Glenfiddich, yeah.
So rye completely almost disappears. Bourbon makes a big push. It comes back. Jack Daniel's, certainly from Tennessee, makes a huge, huge push. And rye really gets left behind. And what happens is in the early 2000s, there's this whole ring of writers and craft cocktail people who are starting to talk about whatever happened to rye. And it's people like Dave Wondrich and Jim Meehan and I can't remember the woman who ran Club Pays. But anyway, then you had Linnell, who had the Red Hook. Yeah, no, it's not the Red Hook. She sold a bottle of whiskey that's now worth $30,000 if you could find one that's where the seal hasn't been broken. But she bought that rye, which was like a 20-year-old rye, from Willett when they were on the balls of their you-know-what, because nobody was buying rye. She was able to get these.
Willett's a Kentucky distillery.
And she bought that rye. It was absolutely exquisite. And so a bottle of that goes for about $30,000 if you can find it.
Well, let's talk a little bit deeper here, since we have some samples that you've kindly brought to us to share, to kind of clarify what is the various styles of the states we've talked about, and even the country we've talked about.
Right.
So let's begin, if we could, please, with the first from the previously mentioned state of Maryland. You brought something from the folks at Sagamore.
Sagamore Spirit. The distillery was designed by Larry Ebersold, who at one point in the history of America sold something like 70 to 80% of all the rye being drank in the country for about 4 years. He had worked at the old Seagram's plant, and they made him sell off all his old stocks, and he had a ton of old rye. And people probably drank it under a number of different labels. So they did, it's not even probably. So Sagamore is the Maryland or Baltimore style of rye. So you have a higher corn content in this whiskey. It's still 61% rye. It's actually more than that, but there's a prevalent corn addition to this, and some malted barley.
Yeah.
And you've got a really lovely, to me, a very easy drinking, classic sort of Baltimore style rye.
It's soft and slips down easy. I think that the presence of the malted barley is quite apparent there, and it kind of rounds off the potentially rough edges. It's a gorgeous bottle. Speaking of rough edges, you got a very
it's an amazing bottle.
Unique bottle. I'm sure they've won awards just for the bottle design. Yeah. Congratulations.
So it's owned by the folks by the gentleman who owns Under Armour.
Yep.
And Brian Treacy's the GM, and they're doing great stuff. They have about 7 different finishes that you can taste down at the distillery. It is a show pony of a distillery down there in Baltimore, just not too far from the Inner Harbor. And I think they're just doing some great stuff, and it's a very easy, drinkable rye whiskey. It's a great, for those people who like that lighter style. The other interesting thing about Baltimore or Maryland rye is that originally it was not meant to be a style. It just became a marketing term. And in the end, the style actually became something. So it's kind of interesting how it kind of all...
Case of the cart driving the horse.
The horse, exactly.
All right. Let's move on to another...
Dad's Hat.
Next state is PA. We're moving on to Dad's Hat, another distillery I've had the pleasure of visiting. Let me pour first for Matt. He's looking thirsty. And now to my guest, Carlo, and then to me. So here we have a rectangular, nearly with a little bit of a shoulder style bottle. Dad's Hat, Pennsylvania straight rye whiskey, 95 proof. and aged a minimum of 4 years because it's a straight.
So Herman and John are down there in Bristol, Pennsylvania, and they are making Dad's Hat. And this is sort of classic northern Pennsylvania rye whiskey. This is 95% rye. This is a high rye, if you will.
That 95% refers to the rye, not the proof.
Yes.
Excuse me.
Well, no, that is the proof, and it's also 95% rye.
That keeps things simple.
That keeps things simple. So here you're going to get a lot of that sort of pininess that you expect, that big spice right off the top of the nose.
That's just my smelling it that you got that response out of me. Oh, boy.
Yeah. So this. Now, I have to say, for a cocktail, if you're a rye person, this is your cocktail.
It's assertive. Without even tasting it, there's got a lot going on just from the smell. It's certainly going to carry through on the palate, isn't it? Yeah.
So, I love the Sagamore rye. I think it makes a lovely cocktail. But if you want that big pop of rye, Dad's Hat, you make a Manhattan or an old fashioned with a rye, and it's Dad's Hat. There's no missing it. You're not
never going to cover that.
Never going to cover that.
Okay,
and that's their intention, right? And I really love what they're doing because they've brought back something called Rosen rye. So
yes,
Rosen rye was the predominant rye people used before Prohibition. And during Prohibition and just after, when there was...
So Rosen rye is not a brand, it's a grain.
It's a grain.
It's a type strain of grain.
Thank you very much.
No, it's okay. Because it sounds like a great brand, Rosen rye.
Yeah. So Rosen rye...
by the way, I grew up in Chicago, and the commonly distributed bread was Rosen rye bread.
Is that right?
Yes.
Too funny.
Yes, I don't think it's...
It was the most popularly grown grain, and during the course of the Prohibition and just after the war, it just died out for whatever reason. And so Herm and John have brought back Rosen rye. There are a couple of other distillers across the country who have also worked to bring back Rosen rye. It's fascinating when you read about it. These guys had to go to the seed vaults around the country, and they give you basically like 36 seeds, and you have to replace that withdrawal with 36 provable, Class A seeds to put it back.
So there's a chapter on that in your.
There's a section on that in the book.
It's a rye book. Very good.
It's a fascinating story, and I thought, you sit there and you go, okay, well, it's interesting that they have these seed banks. I don't know what the hell they're doing with them. And it was a really fascinating reason why they have these things.
So is there a certain percentage of the Rosen rye in this particular one?
I think they're all Rosen rye now.
Oh, wow. Okay,
yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, they're pretty amazing people, and they do a great job. They really started getting some lovely exposure and distribution. So Sagamore and Dad's Hat are the two real classic examples of the most famous styles out there.
Maryland and PA.
Maryland and PA.
Okay.
And I think they do a great job doing that. There are others. Funnily enough, the first Maryland rye was actually made at a winery. Fiore Winery did it. It's this small little winery, Mike and his grandson, Tony, and you're sitting there thinking, oh my God. And it was actually very good whiskey, but they're
not committed to it.
They're not a huge distillery. It's a winery. Yeah, but they did a great job, and they're good people, and it was just such an anomaly that they were the ones.
I like the grappa.
The grappa is the best.
Yes,
Their reserve grappa is just dropped dead.
Kudos to the Fiore men. Okay, so let's move on to the next rye whiskey.
All right, so
what do you reckon we should go to?
We could either go Kentucky and Tennessee, or we can go to New York.
Your call, man.
Let's go to New York, because we can then backslide to the other two. And I don't mean that in a nasty way, but I just, let's do that.
All right.
So of all the other whiskeys out there, New York has created something incredibly unique called Empire Rye.
Which is?
Which is a designation that has been created within the state. And the idea was that
it's an independent, non-governmental. No, you don't have to.
You don't have to do it. Yes, but if you want to put the emblem on it that says it's Empire Rye, you have to adhere to the principles of that agreement. You have to sign on to it. And it was started by a bunch of the craft distillers who said, we need to do something that calls out what we're doing. If you're making this from New York grain and you're aging it in New York barrels, and it's you make it and it's aged in your facility, then we need to be able to say that this is New York rye. And this is probably one of the most pronounced New York ryes of all of them. We both know Stout Ridge, and he's a great guy. And I think he's actually making some lovely ryes.
Yep.
The first guy to bring rye back in any kind of way was Ralph Lorenzo over at Tuttletown, which is now Hudson
Valley Distilling.
Yeah. So
owned by William Grant and Sons of Scotland.
He sold out. He did all right.
Yeah.
God bless him. So anyway, what happened was rye started to become popular, and the running gag was they made less rye than the bourbon they spilled when they were making it at the big companies. And rye had been relegated to sort of the old man's drink. Usually you went into a dive bar and they had a dusty bottle of rye, and some ragged old dude with Pall Malls would come in and buy. Ask for a glass.
Pejorative characterization had become people to associate with rye.
Yeah, I mean, those were the dusty covered bottles all the way in the back. And so when Dave Wondrich and Jim Meehan and all these other people downtown start pushing rye, all of a sudden there's not enough rye on the shelves. And I had this great conversation with Amanda Schuster, who's a great writer, but she was also working at Astor Wines and Spirits back in the day. And she was saying that at that time they had no rye. They were calling all these big distilleries and they were out.
Meaning there was no raw or aged rye spirit for anybody to purchase or bottle.
There were about 6 existing brands left over Holt, Pikesville, a bunch of old Rittenhouse, but they were all, very small production, and they were wiped out instantly.
And you would find a bit from the big boys like Wild Turkey.
Right. Wild Turkey and Jim Beam both had one, but again, very small quantities.
Demand wasn't there?
Demand wasn't there. So the stores became desperate. And you had these empty rye shelves, and now if you're a cocktail aficionado or you're a restaurant, guy, you're running around and there's no rye. So they started buying up the craft ryes, and they had no idea if they were good or not. And Ralph was the first man on the scene, and his rye became a hit. And then all of a sudden, that's when craft spirits really took off, because anybody who had a rye could get on the shelves in an instant.
Okay, so tell us, please, this Excelsior brand New York Hudson Valley Straight Rye Whiskey, Designated Empire Rye, that we're tasting now, which is delicious, is made by which distillery?
Copper Sea Distillery here in the Hudson Valley.
Thank you.
So it's a fabulous place. They, again, are dedicated to using only local products. This is a very low-tech distillery, and I mean this with all love. It's kind of like Green Acres meets the distilling, but he makes spectacular whiskey. And so this is his empire. This is one of his 6 different ryes. And this is the most accessible of them. He makes some really big ryes.
It is full-bodied, it's flavorsome, it packs a punch, but it is beautifully poised on all sides, delicious. And he was actually one of the founders of the Empire Rye group, as I understand. Yeah, very good.
And so was Nicole Austin, who's now the distiller over at George Dickel. So there you go.
She's really moved up in the world. Wow.
Just slightly.
I'm sure she's getting a little bit more money than distilling across the river from us here. So let's move on to
the next one is I'm going to do Old Forester.
Old Forester.
So
our first screw cap bottle, maybe our only one today.
I think
it's our only one today.
And Crown Royal, right?
Is that a screw cap?
Yep.
No, is that a pull tab?
No.
It's a plastic screw. This is a aluminum screw, excuse me. All right, we're on the Old Forester, Kentucky Straight Rye, 100 proof. Oh, yeah.
So this is a fascinating conversation. This is made by Brown-Forman. Chris Morris is the master distiller at Woodford, and certainly he oversees Old Forester as well. And they were, Woodford was actually ahead of the curve, ahead of many of the distillers on having some rye. He had just started making rye, and that was his thing, and they really caught the wave very quickly. And I'm sure that was a combination of his smarts and sales feedback and what have you. But they brought back rye with Old Forester. It's the first time they've had a rye since Prohibition. So this is a big deal from them. And this is a Kentucky-made rye. So again, you're talking about a little bit more corn, a little something more toward the Maryland style in that way, but a lovely spicy nose. Ooh.
Indeed,
it's not a weak rye. You're thinking, oh, maybe it's just going to be really soft and easy. It's not. Nope. It's got some spice to it. It's got some body to it. And I think they've done a really outstanding job on making that. I think that was a pretty good effort in there.
I got to say, Old Forester is one of my favorite go-to bourbons. It's been a long time since I tried a rye from them, I have to say, but I love their
It's got
bourbons,
that.
yeah.
It's a deceptive whiskey in that it's got that big caramel flavor up front, and then you get that aftertaste, and you're like, oh wow, there's like a lot of that ginger snap and cayenne and like pine needles all in there in the back.
I'm with you on that. It's definitely more caramel than any other ones we've had previously. To me, that kind of detracts from what I look for from a rye, but it's still a gorgeous drink. It's still a gorgeous drink, yeah. But I could see, because it's made by a bigger company, it's going to have that caramel thing to meet the needs of desires of more of the general palate.
Yeah, and my goal was to try to find a distiller who was actually, I didn't want to have anything that was sourced or anything like that. So I wanted to make sure that we got the big states and we got what they were doing. I think one of the ones I really wanted to try to include was Rockner?
Rockner. Don't know that one.
It's up in the northwest. I think it's Minnesota. I'm off by, I'm a little off. He's making fantastic stuff. So when I started doing the book, I was reading about these different ryes.
A spirit of rye. And by the way, how many distilleries you reckon are making?
Oh my gosh! I forgot. I used to know that number. There's something like 400 or 500 400 whiskeys in that damn book.
Okay, I
almost died writing that.
I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire about having to name every single whiskey rye whiskey producer.
I'm already on Tennessee whiskey at this point. I'm lost.
Okay, all right.
But it's called Rockner, and it's made by Far North Spirits.
Oh, sure.
That's the name of the distillery.
I've heard of Far North, yeah.
So here's a great story, real fast. I was reading all about these different whiskeys, and I'm working on the profiles. And now a few of these craft distillers are starting to mention the rye that they're working with by name. And I thought, well, how many rye whiskeys? I'm a wine guy originally. And to me, I'm like, well, if you're making rye and you're using different grains, then there's got to be a difference, right? So I start making a list of all the whiskeys I'm reading about, and then I start researching each of the grains. So I had a list of like 20 grains, 23 grains. So I sent it to about 3 or 4 different professors at some of the really big grain schools, North Dakota, Michigan, etc. And I get no response. So I'm talking to this young woman who runs Empire Malting, which is out in, again, Michigan or Minnesota. She's an incredibly brilliant young lady. She quit her job at Archer's Daniel Midland, which is this
Indiana. We all heard it, yeah.
Yeah. So she's making 6 figures. She quits everything, sells everything, and moves to Michigan or Minnesota, I forget where. And she sets up she builds her own malting house all by herself. She's like 5'3", and she's like she's welding, she's pouring cement all by herself. It's fascinating.
And the world is not screaming for a malting house.
No.
Not really.
So I'm interviewing her because I find her absolutely fascinating, and I tell her the story. And I said, nobody's gotten back to me. She goes, send me the list, I'll tell you. So I send her this list. She calls me back literally within 24 hours. She goes, I know exactly why they're not responding. And I said, oh, well, what did I do wrong? I'll correct it. I feel like an idiot. And she goes, no, don't bother. She goes, nobody's ever put this list together. Nobody has this. Nobody can confirm whether this is good or bad.
So you're probably the first person that's come knocking at the door asking.
Exactly. And she said, that's why they're not going to respond. She said, most guys who are distillers call up their local seed merchant or grain merchant and say, what do you have?
I'll take what you got.
I'll take what you got. And that's, you were talking earlier about how a lot of grain is grown in Europe. It's almost like a 40-60 split between grain that's grown in America versus Canada or Europe. So much of it comes in through Canada or Europe. Most people have no clue the quantities of grain that are coming in from Sweden, USSR up until recently, or Soviet, Russia rather.
We've come in recent times. We've come to be aware of the amount of wheat that is being grown in the Ukraine and
Ukraine and Germany. But it's amazing.
But those of the spirits where we know that Canada and Russia are the 2 largest wheat and grain overall producers for the entire world.
Amazing. Yeah, it really is. So that was fascinating, and it was so eye opening because. So I'm talking to the distiller from Far North, and I say, I've got this list. He says, let me see the list. And I send it to him because, well, you have a couple I don't have. He said, but I do have 14 that I grew, and I can give you tasting notes. So he had grown, he bought enough to plant an acre of each one of the grains, planted them on his 100-acre farm. So he still had his... I'm sure he was doing which
is a small farm in Minnesota.
yeah, right, exactly. So I think he only grows on 100 acres. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
So he took these 14 acres and he grew each one of these grains and then made them separately and took tasting notes on all of them. And he and I think we were on the phone for 3 or 4 hours. It was insane because we were just going back and forth. He's like, and it was fascinating.
Not too often you meet someone who's digging that deep, shall we say. All right, speaking of digging deep, let's move on to the next rye, which is from Tennessee. Next door to Kentucky.
George Dickel. So I'm spending a lot of time working on Tennessee whiskeys these days. And Dickel is one of the oldest labels in America. And, it's the lesser known of the two Tennessee whiskeys, Jack Daniel's being the other one. What's fascinating is that not only is this a rye, but they do put it through the Lincoln County process. So this is the first.
What is the Lincoln County process?
So the Lincoln County process is where one takes maple that's been cut down and aged, and they put it in these giant piles. It's sort of like stacked up pallets, and they burn it, and they make their own charcoal.
Got it.
That's put into a vat, and then you pour your whiskey over that. It's kind of like a Brita filter for whiskey. And
so this is what Jack Daniel's has made.
Jack Daniel's has been made like this since the 1870s.
Okay, so if this is a Tennessee style.
This is a Tennessee style whiskey.
I'm surprised that folks in Tennessee haven't made more of this, but forget about it. Go on.
I was going to say that's the next book.
Keep your eyes off for those next book.
Sorry about the plug. So anyway, so it's a whiskey making style that dates back 160 years or something like that. And what that does is it takes a lot of fusel oils and a lot of negative characteristics that usually take a long time to age out in a barrel. And some will say that it makes it smoother or sweeter. Those arguments have been going on for literally since the 1880s. Suffice to say that this is the only Tennessee whiskey that I know of, a rye Tennessee whiskey. Jack Daniel's makes one, but I don't know, and I'm sorry, Chris Fletcher, I don't know if theirs is also a Tennessee whiskey.
Subject for your book.
Subject for the book.
Let's move on. Let's taste this.
Anyway, this is a lovely whiskey. It's very smooth. Again, has that nice cayenne gingerbread hit at the back, but again, has that little sweeter shot up at the front.
I agree.
Right? A very lovely kind of whiskey.
Yeah. And the maple-ish is that maple character is there for those people who want to be seduced by that.
It's horrific to me, and I apologize to Davin de Kergamo before we even start this next whiskey, and yet I applaud him at the same time. To pour only one Canadian rye is a miscarriage of justice. Well, there are so many out there.
When we move the show across the border, and you can take that apology back.
There were so many whiskeys I really wanted to pour for Canada. It's a whole nother tasting. So I chose this one, which is the Crown Royal Harvest Rye. Now, this is a really wonderful story, which is why I decided to bring this one along. Davin de Kergamo he's the crown prince of Canadian whiskey. I mean, he really is the foremost writer and authority on Canadian whiskey, and such an incredibly gentle and very nice man. And
you expect no less from a Canadian.
He's incredibly polite, but he's also just a lovely individual and so helpful to me in 1,000 different ways. I have nothing but just wonderful things to say about Davin. So anyway, the fascinating part about this particular rye was that Davin was invited to Crown Royal to go through the tastings on how they set up a Crown Royal blend, which is the 4th best-selling whiskey in the world. And each Crown Royal, which I have to tell you, I was always very spurious about, is made up from about 52 different whiskeys because they have different variations on each of these whiskeys.
Sure, like any good blended whiskey, your Johnny Walkers and such.
Exactly.
They blend it from countless numbers of whiskeys that you want to make a standard, consistent blend.
So first thing Davin confirms is it's absolutely true. You know, you sit there in a room and he said, it's exhausting. It's exhausting, but nonetheless fascinating. So in the middle of this tasting, he tastes this rye whiskey that's made on their oldest still and says, "What is this? Why are you not selling this whiskey?" And they're like, okay, well, we got to get on with what we're doing and what have you. But apparently it gets back to the marketing people and apparently the president. And they said, if Davin says we should be selling this whiskey, maybe we should be selling this whiskey. So they did bottling it. Martin Leger is the master distiller. And of course, when you talk to people who work at big distilleries, and that's a huge difference here. when you're talking about Crown Royal, not even Dickel at this point, but you're talking about Crown Royal or MGP or some of these other.
And Crown Royal is owned by which corporation?
Diageo?
Small company.
Small company. These places, when you become a master distiller at one of these larger firms, the first place they put you is in the dryer room, which most distilleries don't even have, because at the really big distillery,
what is a dryer room?
So a dryer room, let's get into that. So when you're running a big distillery, a big distillery like Seagram's or MGP or Harvest.
MGP is in Indiana, but for those. Yeah.
Yes. So what happens is you get put into a dryer room, and what they do is, at a big distillery, you make as much money out the back door as you make out the front door. The spent grain gets dried and it gets sold as animal feed in 25 or 50 pound bags. It's a huge business. And if you're going to be the master distiller, you need to know how to run the dryer room as much as you need to know how to make whiskey.
Because that dry room is responsible
huge
for
money.
the grain that gets fed to the cattle.
Right. And it's a huge business all by itself. So what happens at these big places is you can only run rye for so long. Rye gets saturated and does not give up that liquid very easily. So you can, because
rye is more dense than wheat,
right?
For those, okay, right.
More dense than wheat or corn,
has less starch, more protein,
right?
Yeah.
So what happens is it holds onto that water, so you can literally blow out your dryers as you're trying to dry the rye. So most of the big corporations don't make rye for more than 2 or 3 weeks, because otherwise they'll blow out their drying area. They have to give themselves time to overcome that, clean the place up, and then go back and do rye all over.
Time is money.
Time is money. So fascinating thing, but Crown Royal said, okay, we're going to give this a try. They introduced it in 2019, and it was instantly named the Whiskey of the Year in 2019.
Wow.
So
and it's Canadian. It's distributed here in the U.S.
It's distributed here in the U.S. It is a limited release every year. They only make so much of it. It's not incredibly overpriced. It's very, very affordable.
So what is that price, more or less?
Under $30 or $34 tops. For this kind of whiskey, it's great. It's a deal of the century. So it's a really wonderful whiskey. It's, again, very drinkable, very smooth. And I think it's fascinating.
I'm with you on that. And we were having a conversation outside before we started this process here in the studio, talking about bigger doesn't necessarily mean worse.
Right.
And the big boys can do it well if they pay attention to quality, and they can do it because of the margin that they work with on their more, should we say, volume products. They can offer the highest level stuff at a very, very reasonable price. Whereas craft folks, they got to put out a top dollar because they got margins that they have to hit because they're in deep to the banks. Carlo, this has been a great dive into rye whiskeys. We've tasted 6 delicious ones here today. I'll rattle them off once again for those of you who want to look for them. The first is Sagamore. They're entry level, 95 proof and 95% straight rye whiskey. The third one up is the Excelsior from Coppersea, just across the river here in the Hudson Valley. Onwards to Old Forester from the folks who bring you all sorts of great whiskeys from Kentucky. That's 100 proof rye. Onward to Tennessee, the George Dickel rye. And then lastly, the Crown Royal from Canada, their Northern Harvest Rye Limited Edition rye whiskey we were just talking about. Carlo DeVito is the author of the big whiskey book, the Drink the Northeast book, and what we're here for today, the Spirit of Rye book. Go to his website, which is what, Carlo?
Just go to my Facebook page. I'm sorry. I do have a website. I apologize. Gosh, I do. So just Carlo DeVito. You just put in Carlo DeVito on Google and it comes right up.
DeVito is one word for those of you who need to know that. And go out look for his books, look for his various speaking engagements with distilleries across the United States. And anything more we can expect for you in the near future, Carlo?
Oh, I don't know. Working on a Tennessee whiskey book, and then I'm going back to Mark Twain and Charles Dickens for a while.
And lastly, what's your social media handles we can throw out to the folks?
I'm on Instagram as Carlo DeVito, and I'm on Facebook as Carlo DeVito as well.
Wow. What's Twitter?
I am not on Twitter.
Good man. I got off of it because of the recent kerfuffle. Hey.
Yeah, I'm not on Twitter.
Okay, that's Drinking on the Edge with Carlo DeVito and a whiskey author aficionado. Carlo, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you, man.
Guys, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it, dude. Thank you so much.